presentation of this session. So good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the session about carbon issues. And we will have the first speaker, Sascha Lehman, who's going to talk about beyond compliance, strategic use of emissions trading. So Sascha, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. So I will share my slides. So I hope you can see my slides now.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Sascha Lehman. I'm a PhD student at the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research in Karlsruhe in Germany. And I would like to present you the results of a research project which I had worked on. The colleagues you can see here on the slides, and I think Joachim and Regina are also in the call here in the session. And we analyze the strategic use of emission trading in Europe for the European emission trading scheme. But let me first give a short introduction. The European emission trading scheme was launched in 2005. And at that time, it was the greatest and biggest emission trading scheme in the world. It regulates at the moment emission from electricity generation, energy intensive industries, and since 2012 also aircraft operators. It is divided into trading periods. So the first trading period was between 2005 and 2007, followed by the second trading period between 2008 and 2012. And the third trading period was between 2013 and 2020. And at the moment, we are in the fourth trading period. Over the time, the ETS has grown because the European Union was extended, and also in greenhouse gases, not only in member states, also in greenhouse gases since 2013. Not only CO2 is regulated, but also other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And at the moment, there are ongoing discussions to extend the ETS to other sectors, like, for example, the building sector or the transport sector. The ETS was often criticized because the prices were very, very low in a long period of time. And but I think at the moment we see prices above 50 euros. So it seems that this issue isn't a problem anymore. For regulated companies, of course, the emission trading scheme is a very relevant part of their costs. And of course, they want to minimize these costs. And therefore, in theory, emission trading achieves a given target at minimum costs if the companies minimize their costs and they bid for allowances at their marginal abatement costs. This means that they don't want to pay more for allowances than it would cost them to minimize 1 ton of CO2 or to abate 1 ton of CO2. But this efficiency result depends largely on the willingness and the ability to trade allowances. So we have two factors. First, we have transaction costs. So the companies have to employ staff that carry out the trades, that gather information about price expectations in the ETS, about abatement costs, and so on. And of course, this information could also be wrong. And these two factors could reduce the efficiency of the emission trading scheme. So both factors can also lead to a situation in that the companies don't want to trade because it's too costly, because transaction costs are too high, or they incorrectly evaluate the opportunity cost of holding allowances. And that's why it's very important to analyze the factors that encourage companies to trade actively in the emission trading scheme. And that's also why we asked us these two questions here. We want to analyze how characteristics of companies and institutional features affect companies' trading behavior. And we also want to explore the difference over time. So the previous literature, we don't have much literature on this topic. We have a lot of literature on the ETS in general, but not on the strategic behavior of the regulated companies. We have, for example, Sascha, who analyzed determinants of participation in emission trading in the first period. And his results suggest that participation is driven by size, sector, ownership structure, and value of free allocation. We have some other studies, for example, Żarajty, Kasukowski, and Kasukauskas. They analyzed trading behavior in the first trading period, and they found that small companies were less likely to participate in trading because they have relatively seen higher transaction costs. And the results of Cludius from 2018 and Nägele, and also Hintermann and Ludwig and Burtraw et al., they all found substantial transaction costs. So we have, and especially for small companies. So there are a transactional cost problem in the ETS. And for example, also Sascha in 2020 concentrates on the second trading period. And his results show that primary allocation of allowance only weakly impacts abatement behavior of electricity companies. So what can we contribute to the existing literature? We have a longer temporal scope. So our data run from 2005 to 2014. This means that it includes 2 full years of the third trading period, and we saw before the third trading period major reforms of the ETS. For example, electricity companies don't receive free allocation anymore, and we think that these reforms it's very likely that these reforms influenced the trading behavior. And in addition, we have a broader set of outcome variables. Most of the previous literature only focus on total trading volume and also sum of number of transactions, but we also have the use of market intermediaries, so like banks, so for example, financial intermediaries, and we also analyzed the use of forwards and futures. In addition, we also analyzed the influence of the net position on the trading behavior. Net position we defined as free allocation minus actual emissions. We also add to the European Union data sets the Orbis data set, which contains information about companies, size of company, sector of company, and also I think revenues, benefits, etc. So that's also new. The data we downloaded on the European Union Commission's website. It's the EUTL data, European Union Transaction Log data. And we have 3 data sets downloaded from this website: the transaction data, account data, and installation data. And as I said, in addition, we also used the Orbis database, and we matched the EUTL data with the Orbis database with the company registration number. And in cases where this was not possible, we used the account names and the addresses of the account holders. But of course, we couldn't match all of the data to a company in the Orbis data. So as I said, we have data available from 2005 to 2014. And of course, we can split the data into trading periods. The sample was at transaction level, at monthly level, from January 2005 to April 2015. And we aggregated this data on an annual per company basis. And then we exclude administrative transactions because in our view, these transactions are not strategical behavior. These transactions have to be carried out by the companies because they receive their free allocation, they have to surrender their allowances. And we also exclude, of course, trades between authorities. We defined a trading year in our data set running from May to April because the surrender of allowances is due to at the end of April. So that's why we defined it this way, because we see a lot of trading before the end of April, and that's typically for the surrender of the allowances. We only include regulated stationary installations and the respective companies, of course. That's why because we want to analyze the behavior of the regulated companies and not the behavior of banks and financial intermediaries or other companies that are not regulated but participating in emission trading. We removed all transactions between accounts of the same installation. Because again, we don't think that this is strategical behavior. We think that is more administrative transactions. As I said, we defined 4 indicators: total transaction, which means the volume a company traded in 1 year. We define transaction frequency, which is the number of transactions in 1 year. The use of intermediaries, that's the number of intermediaries in 1 year, used in 1 year, and the use of forwards and futures, which we estimated. As explanatory variables, we have the net position. As I said, it's defined free allocation minus actual emissions or verified emissions. And we have a variable for carbon leakage. This means if a company belongs to a sector which is on the carbon leakage list. We have a variable for energy. This means that the company belongs to the energy sector. We have productivity, which is revenues divided by the number of employees. And we have the number of employees for the size of the company, and also another variable for the size is the number of installations which are regulated under the EU ETS. In addition, we also have some dummies for the trading period and for some regions. We applied panel econometric models for total transactions and the use of forwards and futures. We applied panel double hurdle models. We used these models because you can distinguish here between the participation and the intensity. So the participation means that a lot of companies don't want to participate in emission trading because their free allocation is enough for the surrender of allowances. And in this case, they don't have to trade. And a lot of companies don't trade because their free allocation is enough. And that's the first hurdle. If a company participates in trading, so if the trading is not the trading volume is not zero in 1 year, and the intensity, this is the second hurdle, which means how much or how big was the volume of allowances which was traded per company per 1 year. For transaction frequency and for use of intermediaries, we use panel count data models with Poisson distribution. And in addition, we employ month-log approach to capture time constant unobserved heterogeneity. Our results, you can see here. I think we should first concentrate on total transactions. You can see that all our indicators are, all our variables are positive and significant. So you can see for both, for participation and for intensity. So you see that net position, if you have a higher net position, then it's more likely that a company participate in emission trading, and it's also more likely that it trades more allowances in 1 year. Also, the same is true for carbon leakage, for the energy sector, for productivity, employees, and installations. And you can see also here that in the second period and the third period, companies were more likely to participate in emission trading and also trade higher amount of allowances. For the regions, you can see that region 6, these are the Nordic countries. Companies from these regions are more likely to participate, but they trade lower volumes. For transaction frequency, the results are in the same way, but we don't have a significant value for productivity. But you can see that the results are quite similar, and there are no there are no minus values here. Also, again, you see that the Nordic countries trade, the companies from the Nordic countries are more likely to trade more frequently. For the use of intermediaries, again, the results go in the same direction. And but in this case, we didn't have a significant value for the number of employees. For the use of forwards and futures, again, we see that the results are going in the same direction as for the other 3 indicators. But in this case, for the participation hurdle, we don't have significant values for productivity and the number of employees. And we see for the regions, the German-speaking countries were the base region. So we see that the German-speaking countries, the companies from their use are more likely to use forwards and futures, and they use it more intensively. So overall, we think our results are quite plausible because net position, if you are very long or very short in allowances, it's quite likely that you will participate in emission trading, because if you are very short, you have to buy the allowances, and if you are very long, you want to monetize the allowances. And also for carbon leakage, we think it's quite plausible because companies on which are belong to a sector on the carbon leakage list, they probably have more competitive pressure, and that's very likely that they want to minimize the costs of the ETS. Also, for the energy sector, it seems plausible because the energy markets are often comparable to exchanges, or they trade their products on exchanges, so they are quite familiar with exchange trading. And therefore, we think that it's very likely that the barriers are a bit lower for the energy sector. And for the size of a company, it's also quite plausible because we think that, or it's very likely that you have fixed transaction costs, and in relative terms, for bigger companies, these transaction costs will be lower. So if we compare our results with previous studies, they are very comparable because they are going in the same direction. For net position and energy sector, we measured an increase in emission trading activities for if you belong to the energy sector, or if you have a higher net position. And the results of Cludius and Schleich, Kasukowski and Kasukauskas and Saklan show similar findings. We cannot compare our results for carbon leakage because I don't know some research which also include this variable. For productivity, we measured a positive value. Saklan in 2013, on the other hand, found no evidence that a company's profitability is associated with trading activity. We think profitability and productivity could be very likely correlated. For the size of companies, which we measured as number of employees, but also with a number of installations, we find that bigger companies are more likely to participate and trade higher volumes. And these results are also in line with previous studies. Region dummies and trading period dummies we cannot compare with other studies because they don't use these variables. We also run some robustness checks. We run a separate regression for the 3 trading periods within the scope of the study. And in general, the results looked quite similar, and there are no outliers there. This means that factors related to various emission trading activities remain stable over time. And we also run a model which allows for an asymmetric response of net sellers and net buyers. And again, for this model, most of the results are consistent with those for the model for which I showed you the results. And but this model is interesting because without market frictions, the opportunity cost of holding allowances should be the same for net buyers and net sellers. So we could expect that that net sellers and net buyers that for them that they don't trade different in their strategies. But our results show that it is more likely for net buyers to participate in emission trading than for net sellers. Maybe they are afraid of paying the fee, or we don't know. But this asymmetry possibly reflects a violation of theorem, which says that the participation should be independent of the property. But we also see that this asymmetry has declined over time. And yeah, we think that this could also be a topic for future research here. So if we, now I would like to come to the end, and I can summarize our study here. Yeah, we see that since 2013, an increase of auctioning, and this could have increased also the efficiency because more companies were forced to buy their allowances on the market and forced to participate, therefore, in emission trading. But we also see that for small emitters, and we see also, or there are still very high transaction costs. And we think the barriers could be reduced by, and the small companies could be encouraged to participate at auctions. For example, if you use an electronic bulletin board as trading institutions, that would be more accessible than an exchange. And I think if you look at in the data of the EU TL, you see that only very, very few companies participate at the auctions, and a lot of the companies which are participating in the auctions are financial companies. So to reduce the barriers to participate in auctions could be increase the efficiency of the market, because more companies would then participate. On the other hand, to also encourage more companies to participate in auctions is to use consignment auctions instead of the free allocation. In this case, the free allocation is offered at auctions, but the original holder, this means the company which would receive the free allocation, in this case would receive the financial value of the allowances, which is then determined in the auction. And but the allowances which are auctioned go to the highest bidder. So in this case, more companies have to participate in emission trading, and they have to be active on the market. This consignment auctions approach, yeah, could be, or is not necessary if the free allowances, free allocation of allowances will not continue if we introduce the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is currently under discussion in the European Union. And I think in the Fit for 55 package, which is, I think the publication date is the 14th of July, we will see if the carbon border adjustment mechanism will be introduced in the European Union or not. So, and also for the ETS, we will see how free allocation, if free allocation continues or if it not continues. So yeah, we will see it in the Fit for 55 package. And yeah, that's all from my side. And I think Regina and Joachim are also on the call. We are happy to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Sascha. I don't know if anybody has a question, but while waiting for hands to rise, I have few clarification issues I would like to submit to you. First, I didn't understand how you evaluate the transaction cost for companies? Is it like a global cost, an average cost that is attributed, or how do you realize this assessment?
We don't have a value for this, but we can assume that the transaction costs exist, because if there are no transaction costs, a lot of companies would trade actively, and they want to trade allowances. So it's only an assumption. We see that a lot of companies are very passive and they don't trade allowances with other companies. We see that they receive their free allocation and they render their allowances at the end of the year. And if there are no transaction costs, it's very likely that they want to trade allowances in the year, and they maybe want to monetize the free allocation at the beginning of the year and buy at a later stage the allowances back. But we don't see, for a lot of companies, we don't see this behavior. And we think that we can assume that this is due to high transaction costs.
Okay, so this is an assumption.
Yeah, that's only an assumption, which we see in the data. We see this in the data, and we think that's probably due to the due to transaction costs. Yeah, Joachim, you raised your hand.
Yeah, hello. Just to add to this, to what Sascha mentioned, I mean, what we see and we follow the literature is that variables that are supposed to capture reflect the impact of transaction costs, which is like company size, which we measure as the number of employees or the number of installations are negatively related, or let's say larger companies positively related with participation in the market, and also with the intensity to which the emissions trading market is used. So to us, that is indicative of transaction costs playing a role. So in that sense, we have similar findings as previous literature. And what's interesting is that these factors pertain over time. So between the very beginning of the emissions trading system in 2005 up to 10 years afterwards, which is until we had data available. So I think this is the interesting part. So as you correctly noticed, we do not have a direct measure of transaction costs, but we indirectly infer the influence of transaction costs through variables which we've employed, which is again size of the company and number of installations, and in that sense, following the literature.
Okay, thank you. And I was also curious about how you collect the data. Are they naturally associated, I mean, transaction with specific companies? Then you can know the size, and because I was astonished that these data are public.
Yeah, transaction data is available at the Commission website. It's called European Union Transaction Log data. And transaction data is, at the moment, I think, published with a 3 years delay. And in this data, you see all the transactions, all the trades, and you see the involved accounts. So you see the buyer and the seller. And in addition, you can also download from Commission websites information on the accounts.
Okay.
So who is the owner of the account? You see the name of the company typically, and you also see, in most cases, the company registration number. And you can also download from the Commission website information on installation, which means the free allocation, and also the verified emissions. And of course, you can match these three data sets via installation ID or account ID. And in addition, we use the Orbis database, which is a database which includes information. So you have to buy this data at the Bureau van Dijk. and this contains information about revenues, about number of employees, about sector and ownership structure, and so on. And we matched these Orbis data to the commission data via the company registration number. And in cases where this was not possible, we used the address and the name. Yeah.
Okay. And I have a final question about your conclusion. So your thesis is to tell us that anyway, free allocation will not continue. But even if it's more interested to have this carbon border adjustment mechanism. And as far as I'm not familiar with this mechanism, can you just develop this point?
Yeah, so the first point is we don't, I have no idea if free allocation will continue or not. We think it could increase the efficiency of the emission trading scheme if it's not continuing. Because in this case, more companies are forced to participate in emission trading, and if more companies participate, then the efficiency of the whole system would increase. And if we have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, carbon border adjustment means that companies who want to import products into or bring products into the European Union. So for example, if a Korean iron and steel manufacturer wants to bring iron and steel to Europe, they have to pay like a tax for the CO2 which is on their steel. So in this case, so our industry would be protected with such a mechanism. Yeah. I think at the moment the discussion is that they have to pay like a tax which is equal to the emissions which are on the products and times the current price of allowances in the European Union emission trading scheme.
Okay.
So in this case, we don't have the problem of carbon leakage because all of the imports would be, the prices for the imports would increase. So in this case, we don't have the problem of carbon leakage. And I think then there is no reason why free allocation should continue.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's clear. Okay, thank you, Sascha. Are there any other questions? If they're not, Theo team, can you correct me? I think we have reached the end of the session.
I think Thomas Turner just arrived, right? I see him. Yeah,
I'm here.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so welcome. And
thank you.
We will listen to the second talk. So this review of transport sector hybridized regulatory market policy instrument. And please, Thomas, take the floor.
Good. Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen? The tradable performance standards here with some beautiful mountains there.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Good. Great. So I'm actually standing in here for Sonia, who was originally going to do this presentation, but is otherwise occupied. And so the slides are actually hers, and I have presented the paper. I kind of presented it in a different order. So if I seem slightly lost. That's the main reason. We in this paper we set out to compare tradable performance standards, to describe them and compare 4 big programs, and also to try to undertake a sort of a generalized comparison with carbon taxes. And let's see. So carbon taxes, of course, are a direct way of internalizing the climate externality, or part of it anyway. In Europe, for instance, we have sectoral carbon taxes. So in practically all countries of Europe, we have really high effective prices on fossil fuels like diesel and gasoline from fossil origin. And as some of you might know, I mean, we have prices of sort of $9 a gallon for these fuels throughout most of Europe. And of course, the effect of that is that these fuels are typically used less heavily. The consumption per capita is much smaller than in the United States or in Australia or in countries where the fuels are cheaper. And it's politically very difficult to raise carbon taxes. There's typically a lot of resistance, and so a number of countries have tried other approaches. And what the not least California and the United States in general has pioneered a number of approaches where you set a performance standard. You sort of say that, well, in the future at some particular date, we're going to have cars that have very low emissions, or extremely low emissions, or zero emissions. And you can sort of set a target, saying a certain percentage of the vehicle stock is by a certain year required to meet each of a set of characteristics. And of course, this is a very, as I describe it now, a very much a command and control kind of approach. One of the big advantages of market-based instruments like the carbon tax is that it does not prescribe certain technologies or limits at certain dates. It just has a more sort of general incentive effect. On the other hand, since carbon taxes are so unpopular, there's still interest in developing the alternatives. And what has happened, I think, historically, is interesting. In the countries, jurisdictions, I should say, where performance standards have been used, they typically have been set, first of all, a number of years into the future, so that they're politically somehow accepted. And then there have been various ways, various sort of flexibility mechanisms to allow for their for compliance. So and we're going to look at a number of cases, some for fuels where you sort of typically set a performance standards in grams of carbon dioxide per mile or per gallon or something, and for vehicles. And then originally what the companies or the could do to meet the standards was to either to produce or buy more of the low carbon technology, or to pay a fine. However, over time, various other flexibility mechanisms have been added so that you've been able to bank, for instance. So if you have credits, you can bank them a year. And eventually also tradability has been introduced. So when you have tradable performance standards, companies can both buy, sell, bank, and or sometimes borrow credits. And here we have a figure showing the historical fleet carbon emissions for passenger vehicles, and this is in grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer. Going back to 2000, you can see that there's very roughly, we're speaking of a halving, 50% reduction of carbon emissions per mile. So it's in a 25-year period. That's at least a start. Of course, compared to what we actually have to do with carbon, there's more to do. What tradable performance standards particularly do is perhaps to set out a path for the future and promote innovations into really radically better technologies. And I think people perhaps sometimes think that pricing is better for smaller marginal current decisions, and tradable performance standards perhaps better for big and long run decisions. I'm not necessarily convinced of that, but that's the one aspect. There are multiple other aspects, as effect of imperfect competition, for instance, and consumer behavior. Sometimes consumers don't fully appreciate the associated savings of having a more energy efficient equipment, for instance, but they maybe look more at the price of the vehicle than total running costs. There's also tradable performance standards have typically been adapted to a number of goals. So climate change is one of the goals addressed, but also oil, energy independence, political risk of having to import your fuel, and local air pollution, and all kinds of even agricultural policy and so on, typically get mixed up into these. Policymakers could only handle a limited number of instruments and reforms at a time, and so we typically we don't always follow the old Tinbergen rule of having one instrument for each problem, but instead we bundle problems and choose one instrument to try to solve many problems. So we're going to speak about sort of abstract textbook concepts in the dirty technology, clean technology, and you could think of a number of different examples here. Dirty technology might be driving a diesel car, and then the clean technology shouldn't be interpreted as being absolutely clean, but being relatively cleaner, and that could be taking a bus. It could also be driving another car than a diesel car, or using another fuel. The dirty technology could be electricity from coal, and the clean technology could be electricity from either natural gas as an intermediate, or it could be from renewables. And of course, that when we say, it might sound like there's an enormous difference there. In fact, there is an important difference. Of course, renewables are the sort of more of an ultimate goal. Natural gas is, in many cases, unsatisfactory, immediate. But natural gas has perhaps half the emissions typically from coal. Renewables doesn't have zero emissions. We need to remember that we're looking here at life cycle emissions. And so producing the windmills or the solar cells also requires energy. And at least with current technology, that energy itself is made partly with fossil fuel. And so the emissions are not necessarily zero from the clean technology. The concepts must be thought of as relative here. The effect, I'll just do that. If we add a carbon tax, if we have a carbon tax as our main policy instrument, by the way, the chairman, how long time do I have? And maybe you could give me a 5-minute warning or something.
Yeah, so you have one more, like a quarter, yeah, until 25.
Okay, good. But I usually don't have a clock and with the full screen, I don't see but so just give me a 5-minute warning or something. So if we add a carbon tax, this we already have a production price for the fuel. The carbon tax will add depending on the size of the tax, a large increase in the price, as is the case, for instance, where I live here, gasoline prices consist mainly of tax. But the tax also typically does increase the price of the clean fuel, because the clean fuel is not unless it's completely clean, of course. But few fuels have zero emissions in a life cycle perspective. So typically there would be an increase in both the price of the dirty fuel, the dirty technology, and the clean technology, somewhat clean technology. And it's the difference between the increase in price of the dirty technology and the clean technology that is that we will call the incentive margin. That is the driving force behind transition. If instead of a carbon tax, we use a tradable performance standard, then the tradable performance standard requires requires the market producers to sell a certain percentage of the clean technology. And this is, in effect, a sort of a subsidy to the clean technology. Those who produce the clean technology, this could be corn ethanol, or it could be Teslas, or depending on the case, they will receive credits. The producers of the dirty technology, they are forced to sort of either produce lower the implied emission of their product, which they typically have difficulty in doing, or pay a fine, or the third alternative is buy credits from some other firm that has a surplus. And this is typically the corn ethanol producers or the Tesla producers on the market. So this means that the producers of the clean fuel earn money from credits, and they can actually sell their product somewhat cheaper. Those who sell the dirty technology, they are forced to buy these credits, so their product will be a little bit more expensive. And you can see in the right-hand part of the diagram there that the effect of the tradable performance standard will be a very small increase in the price of the dirty technology, but a reduction in the price of the clean technology. And so, but in a very simple case, we could imagine that the incentive margin will be the same. So the difference between the increase in the price of the dirty technology, fall in the price of clean technology, incentive margin under the tradable performance standards might be the same as the incentive margin tax regime. And so the pressure for transformation is the same. But, and this is of course a big but here, the popularity of the scheme is kind of evident from this diagram. If you go out and ask people who are naive, I mean, neither economists nor environmental activists, and just say, would you prefer bus prices to go up a lot, and then diesel price for cars to go up even more, or a small increase in the price of diesel and then a reduction in the price of the green alternative, let's say corn ethanol. And of course, most people will choose the right-hand alternative where none of the prices change very much. And one of them goes down, and the dirty one they perhaps choose only goes up a little bit. So the political resistance to the scheme on the right, performance standard, is likely to be much smaller than resistance to the price increase that is caused by carbon tax. And this is the same. I mean, this is independent of this principle is independent of the level of tax, of the overall level of the incentive margin. So you can see here with rising carbon or credit prices to the right, you can see the picture to the left captures one sort of example of this, but in fact, whether you have $50 carbon tax or $200 carbon tax, we can apply the same principle. Either have a very big or bigger and bigger difference between the price of the dirty technology and the clean technology, through both of them getting more and more expensive, or through one of them being more and more subsidized and the other one just rising a little bit. So there's it's clear that the popularity of the price effects of the tradable permanent scheme are likely to be better than for a carbon tax, but there's also there are some risks, unintended consequences, since the price doesn't go up very much, or in fact, the price of the clean technology, the renewable or low carbon fuel, or low emitting vehicles for that matter, since they are actually subsidized, there is the risk of a rebound effect, so that people feel, oh, this green alternative is so much better. You don't have to have a bad conscience. It's not polluting the climate so much, and it's also cheap, and so they may buy more of the product, which of course would be counterproductive to purposes here. And this applies to all kinds of general equilibrium effects and effects as well. I mean, originally performance standards were intended to promote technology change and address imperfect competition. One of our conclusions here is that the tradable performance standard is a lot more economically efficient than a non-tradable performance standard that is just simple mandates or regulation. One of the big advantages of market-based instruments is, of course, the flexibility, allowing the producer to explore the technology space. And that can be achieved through taxes, for instance, carbon tax, but it can also be achieved by making the performance standard tradable. On the other hand, the tradable performance standard is always going actually ultimately to be less economically efficient than emission pricing, because there isn't this output effect that incentivizes lower consumption. So if we, for instance, get very low emitting fuels that are also cheap, we will presumably increase our energy consumption more and more, and still have some emissions where, so to speak, there are multiple channels to reducing emissions. One is through technology, and that's the one we're accessing, the performance standard. But there is also the reduction in output. We should, to take the vehicle and fuel example, the appropriate optimal response to climate. The climate problem would be a combination of new technology that is less carbon emitting and less miles driven, less transport work being done. But the latter effect, the output effect, is not incentivized by tradable performance standards. However, it should be said that you can combine carbon with tradable performance. So that pretty much sums up the sort of well, at least a bit of an overview of the theory or conclusion part. There's also an empirical part where we actually go through 4 major programs, the CAFE programs, which are national for the United States, and look at reduction of greenhouse gas intensity of vehicles, CAFE standards. There's a quite, in a sense, similar program in California and 9 other states called the Zero Emission Vehicle Program. And then we have 2 programs. So those first two programs look at vehicles, and the second 2 look at fuels. And this is the Renewable Fuel Standard Program, which is a national program in the United States. and aims to increase the share of biofuels. It's designed to look at the sales volume. There's again a California equivalent that is somewhat more radical. In this case, it's California and Oregon. And it looks at the greenhouse gas intensity fuels, and looking at the life cycle emissions intensity in grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of energy intensity. And so each of these programs is quite big and complicated, and we have tried to boil down the essential and comparable elements, to compare them to each other and to carbon taxes. There was a number of difficulties in doing this. Some of the transactions are, some of the programs, not mandatory to report, so that there is sometimes missing information on both, particularly on prices.
Thomas, you have like 1 or 2 minutes more.
Oh, I see. I thought, well, okay. But I think, in a sense, I have made some of the main conclusion points. We have quite a large number of sort of illustrative examples. Some of the really nice and striking ones here are how Tesla has this is, I think, no exaggeration to say that it is the California's EV program that has made the Tesla boom possible. At least it is one very important component in Tesla's success story. In a couple of years, the Tesla credits, that is the zero emission vehicle credits that they sold to companies like Ford, actually accounted for more than 100% of Tesla's profits. That is to say that Tesla made a loss selling vehicles that was more than compensated for by selling credits. Or another way of saying this is that it was the state, the regulator, that gave Tesla its profits through requiring zero emission vehicle credits in this program. And at least in the early years around 2013, this was of crucial importance. So we can see in 2012 was credit sales accounted for 135% of their gross profits. We don't have consistent numbers for every year because this is all this information not always disclosed, but some of it is sometimes disclosed. And in 2013, Tesla made $28,000 per vehicle, which is obviously a very large share of the sales price, and in fact more than perhaps 135% or something of the gross margin. That has been that's the phenomenon around 2012-13. This share, the profit from the sales credits has been decreasing as a share, and of course today Tesla is money selling vehicles. Prices have come down, costs have come down. All kinds of things have happened, but it was important in the start. When we look at when we look at renewable fuels, we have corn ethanol. The orange fuel here is really quite dominant, but there is an increase lately in biomass-based diesel. because there are difficulties in blending in more than 10% ethanol into gasoline, and it's technically easier to make diesel, biodiesel.
Thank you so much. Can you conclude now?
Yes, I'll do that. Let's see. Well, credibility of the programs and the is very important for. I mean, but a number of this is the California low carbon fuel standards. There's a number of years when the companies are sort of building up more and more credit banks, and then you sort of come to a point where they start drawing down. Prices have been going up recently of this, and the program is extended to 2030. Let me see. I do have one or two slides here.
Okay, if we continue, we will not have any time for discussion.
Okay, well, I'll finish
just choose what you prefer.
Go ahead. So, and I have a problem with my connection here. No, I need to recharge mine. Otherwise, I'll lose you completely. There we are.
Okay, so thank you very much, Thomas. Yeah.
With questions, that's fine.
Who has questions? And if there is no, I have one remark regarding the fact that these taxes target transportation, some transportation technologies. And in fact, I was wondering if you have thought about what you design as a consumer inelasticity to fuel price changes, like if we have to combat that with taxes or trading tradable credits or whatever. But I would like to remind you with the French example, what was the beginning of the Yellow Jackets movement? It was a tax to save to push people to other technologies for the transportation, or to try to limit the transportation. But people don't have the choice, and the problem is more about the lifestyles and the relation with transport. So what do you think, and how these instruments respond to that question?
Yeah, thank you. I've been doing, I've lived in France, and I followed the movement of the Gilets jaunes quite closely, and done actually similar other work on the Yellow Vest movement in Sweden. We just interviewed petrol protesters here. So that's a subject I'm very interested in, and in spite of the fact that Europe, in a sense, is a success story where gigantically high carbon taxes actually have been accepted by society. We saw in France the movement that it's difficult to raise them. I mean, they are already, a dozen times higher than the taxes in the United States, in France. But we saw that the effort a year or two ago to raise the prices further, that met with a lot of resistance. And it's not really clear yet, I think, but there is a lot of work ongoing to understand this. Whether or not this really was mainly a reaction to fuel prices. I mean, it was also a reaction to the removal of the wealth tax and inheritance tax and to Macron's rather right-wing policy and arrogant style as well. So that was a part of it. But of course, one possibility is to switch. I mean, that is actually happening in Sweden, for instance, at the moment. Although we already have high carbon taxes, the policymaker is wary of increasing them further, and they're adding a kind of tradable performance standards to the fuel on top of the tax. I suppose to say this very bluntly, the gamble is that the tradable performance standards are so complicated that partly people won't understand them or protest, and partly, of course, that there is a built-in difference that you are, instead of just raising the prices, you are lowering the prices of the cleaner alternative, and so the state is in a sense subsidizing or not taxing. Of course, in the end, there are no free lunches. It is still, if there are social costs, the society still has to bear them. So partly this is cosmetics, but partly it might be smart. And I think the answer will be different societies. The optimal combination of, I mean, you can, with a tax, you can either refund the tax, or you can use the revenues for climate use, or you can use them for social use. You can refund them, or you can hide them, which is really what you do with a tradable performance standard.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas.
Thanks.
Is there any other question?
Nadia, I've got a question.
Yeah, please, Regina.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for an interesting presentation. First, small comment. You were talking about the carbon taxes in Europe in the transport sector. I think these are rather like fuel taxes in order to have income, or it's more like I think Sweden is one of the few countries which has really explicitly called it a carbon tax, and many European countries have even the wrong difference between diesel and petrol when you look at the CO2 emissions. But of course, we have, almost all countries have some type of tax on fuel. I was wondering, and then, I mean, Europe has these performance standards, which are for new passengers, cars, and now also for light vehicles and more heavy vehicles. But I don't think we have any tradable ones. Is that correct? And I'm wondering, is there a resistance? Because, I mean, as you just mentioned, Tesla was profiting a lot of it. So if the countries which have the car producers are basically the ones profiting, or would that not happen within the European Union? I'm just wondering what would be the distributional consequences if we would introduce something like that in Europe.
Yeah, so I think several good questions and comments there in one go, and it's true, and there's a lot of complicated politics going on here, and it's probably no coincidence California is both environmentally progressive and kind of pioneered the more aggressive instruments. It's also the country, the state where new technology typically has a lot of voice. There's a lot of Silicon Valley, and there is Tesla. So there are some winners who presumably, it's no big guess, are lobbying in favor of these policies. And there are other states where General Motors and Ford have their big production units, and they will be more low. In Europe, this would be different countries, which makes it slightly more complicated, probably. The one thing people often say that the European fuel taxes somehow don't count. I think that's, in my mind, I think that's an unfortunate way of looking at it. We need some positive examples of a carbon tax. We actually have one. It's true that maybe the finance ministers. I mean, we've had fuel taxes, petrol taxes in Europe for so many decades that very few people. I mean, I've studied this in a lot of detail actually, but few people really know what their original purpose was, and maybe it was fiscal. Maybe the government wanted tax revenues, but the fact is, it doesn't really matter what the finance minister or environmental minister were thinking. The effect is the same. If gasoline is expensive, people will buy smaller cars and drive shorter distances. So I still think that these act like de facto carbon taxes. Although you are correct that there are differences between diesel and gasoline that they're interesting and complicated. There's both the local pollution effects and the climate effects, which are opposite. Diesel is very efficient as a carbon, from a carbon viewpoint, but then it produces some nasty health damaging emissions. So it's complicated.
Yeah, maybe one addition to it. Like we have looked at Switzerland, not like we don't have a carbon tax explicitly on petrol and diesel. We have it more on the fuels for heating and in industry. And we found that so in Switzerland the CO2 tax is increasing dramatically. I'm going to present this later today. Like it's like a 400% increase. We are now at 96 Swiss francs, which is kind of similar to US dollars. And people have been reacting more on the tax than they have been reacting on the total price of oil, which is very volatile. And I'm wondering, so there might be a behavioral difference if you call it a carbon tax, and if there is an expectation that it will rise. So, it could be a good, even though it might, not make such a big effort, but psychologically it might make a difference if you call it a carbon tax and you give the impression that it's rather likely to increase than to decrease in the future. Whereas, these excise taxes, which we have on the fuels, I think they were pretty much stable over time since long. So maybe this would be an idea to ask European politicians to to change the names.
Yeah, it's a big field which I've actually been following for a long time, I agree. It's there are both on the one hand, you really want to, in order to have an effect on technology, you really want people to understand that this is something that is going to rise over time for a long time. That's the way you get a technology effect. Unfortunately, that's also the way you build up popular resistance. The ideal perhaps would be to get the technical car designers and people to understand that this is going to be big and rise, but not get the public to understand it. But that's a very sort of sneaky way of putting it. So I don't really want to do it that way either.
Yeah, maybe if I may, I mean, the Swiss people were quite good in combining, the kind of quantity instrument with the price instrument. So the tax will only rise if the quantity is not achieved.
I see.
So this gives a bit of so people understand climate change, and they understand that we need to do something. And if they are aware that, you know, if we are not, like if the emissions are not decreasing to levels which are foreseen, then they would need to increase the tax. And so this is an automatic kind of mechanism. But the tax started very low at 12 francs. So it started low, but it was rising quite quickly. And always, you know, it was this Baumel and Oates kind of very old idea of having a combination where you are not sure what the price needs to be. So we do a kind of trial and error to achieve a certain quantity.
That sounds good. And it applies to all fuels, that is for heating and for industry as well?
Yes, exactly. It's and we are going to vote this weekend if we want to have the maximum price up to 210 francs in the future. So there's a bit of a tension, a political, if we are able to get the population to support that, because this would, now the maximum is 120. But yeah, I'm
please send me information in an email.
Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. I will end this very interesting session, and have a good day, good continuation in the conference. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
sorry,
everybody.
if I may just, Thomas, could you please kindly, if you didn't, upload your slide on the conference platform, please? You just have to connect on the website and go to your dashboard, and there you can upload
I think Sonia already did that, actually.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Same.
Bye-bye.
Bye.